This lesson is going to discuss William Blake, one of the most influential and I think one of the most interesting writers of the Romantic movement. He was born in 1757, he died in 1827. Blake's ideas about romantic vision and his romantic contribution was heavily influenced by his spiritual training and visions that he claimed that he experienced from the time that he was a young boy. He was born in London. His father was a maker of hosiery, so sounds kind of like Moliere's father. They belonged to the dissenters, and they were part of a radical sect of dissenters. And remember, dissenters are those who are neither Catholic, Anglican, Jewish, or any of the other religions. They are what most of us are descended from. They believed that they were very capable of reading the scriptures themselves and interpreting it on their own. Blake was the third of 6 children, and 2 of his siblings died in infancy. Not uncommon experience in this particular time. Blake worked in his father's shop until he was age 14, and like a lot of writers of this generation, he was mostly self-educated. The problem with Blake, one of the problems with Blake, is that he truly wasn't like other kids. Even his parents recognized that he was really very different, and they were progressive enough not to force him into a traditional school situation in which Blake probably would have been bullied, derided, and not fit in at all. I think, to their credit, being dissenters enabled them to be more comfortable with being different, and Blake was certainly different. He wanted to be an artist, and so his parents encouraged the drawing artistic endeavor, and they enrolled him in school at age 10, and at age 12 he began writing poetry. He did most of his reading and his formal education at home and didn't rely on schoolmasters to provide that for him. He was a fan of the classical artists, and so in some sense that connects to the Enlightenment period, where the ancients believed that those classical artists had it all right. So Blake studied those, and he learned the style and the technique of the art, and then went on to develop something of his own. His father decided art is fine and drawing is good, and Blake obviously had some talent, but he had to earn a living. The Blakes were not wealthy people, and unlike in France, when patronage was given by Louis, just being a hosier didn't give him the income or the class necessary to provide a life for Blake that allowed him to dig into his art and spend all of his time doing it. So they were outsiders. Again, being dissenters, they didn't fit into the mainstream society. So when they decided to apprentice Blake to a printer, they sent him to somebody whose technique was largely outmoded. And the way the system worked in England at this time, if you were apprenticed to some trade, the guy to whom you were apprenticed, and it was almost always a guy, owned you for about 7 years, and he agreed that he would train you in his trade, that he would provide you a place to live, and he would feed you and clothe you. But you were indebted to him, legally contracted to honor your commitment to work for him for free for those 7 years. And when your time was up, then you were ready to obtain your license, to apply for your own license, go out on your own, and be a competitor to the apprenticeship. Well, Bezier was doing printing in a way that technology had already passed by. And so when Blake gets out of his apprenticeship, he spent 7 years or more learning the trade, and then gets out on his own and discovers that nobody's doing the kind of work that Bezier taught him to do. And so he's poor, and he's really struggling to make a living. One important detail that happened, though, when Blake was apprenticed to Bezier was that he sent him to London to study the churches and to draw the churches and to observe what he could about the churches. And an interesting story happens there that I'll share with you in a minute that helps explain a little bit of Blake's personality. The work that he did in copying the image of the churches is significant in his canon. He does join the Royal Academy to study engraving in 1779. But again, the engraving that he knew and the investment that he had made in the process was never on the cutting edge of what everyone else was doing. Blake was probably one of the more spiritual, truly spiritual romantics of the age. And I mean that in a little bit in more of a traditional way. He had studied the scriptures, he knew the scriptures well himself, and he used scripture to inform all of the work that he did. So he also had visions, and he believed that those visions came to him from God. And as we have learned more scientifically and more about brain science, it may be arguable as to how those visions developed, but he believed that they came from God himself. His first vision happened when he was age 4, and he claimed that he saw God's head in a window. At age 9, he claimed that he saw a tree full of angels, that he looked up into the sky, and there in the tree, in the sunlight glinting between the limbs of the tree, were angels, and they were looking at him. In 1787, his brother died from tuberculosis. Blake had been watching his bedside and helping care for him in his last days. Blake claims that he saw his brother's spirit rise up and clap its hands. And obviously, as we continue on and he began to hear those dead people speak, he saw angels in the haymakers as they were gathering their crops together. The list of visions went on and on. His father was really opposed to these visions and was more concerned that they weren't coming from God, but maybe were coming from Satan. And remember, this is a really supernatural time period, and so there's always a question as to whether supernatural events came from a good or a bad source. At Westminster Abbey, while he was assigned to Bezier, he went to, and this is a vacation picture I took when I went there. I always have to have an opportunity to show my vacation pictures. He witnessed people and evil of the world firsthand, and he was quietly drawing the inner workings, the magnificent inner workings of these churches. Artistically, these are incredible places to visit. They're full of nooks and crannies and iconography and all kinds of artwork that is it's overwhelming almost. And so to sit and look at it for a long period of time in segments and draw it was something that helped Blake inform his views of organized religion. He saw and witnessed people, priests and clergy bringing children into the church, and when you do your journal on London, you'll see exactly how that informs part of what he observes. While he was there, he was tortured by some schoolboys, and Blake got very, very angry at the schoolboys for the way that they were tormenting him, and knocked them over, and got kind of physically aggressive with him. So obviously his parents were probably right not to put him in a public school, because he probably wouldn't have played very well with others. Okay, so the interesting thing about his love life, this is just a side story that I think kind of explains Blake's idea about people. He was married to Catherine Boucher, and she became his one and only love, and everything suggests that although their engagement story is a little bit horrifying for those of us who grew up on Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, the marriage was a solid one and a good one, and Blake treated Catherine quite well. She was the daughter of a poor and unsuccessful market gardener. She had no education. She had nothing to recommend her as far as a dowry was concerned, or any marketable skills. But Blake taught her to read, and he taught her to write. He taught her the printing business, and she worked alongside him as a partner. The interesting thing about their engagement is that Blake had asked someone else to marry him, and the woman had refused him. And he grew quite upset about that and went off to visit some relatives of his father's. And while he was staying at this relative's house, he met Catherine, and he told her his tale of woe about how he had been refused. And he said to her, "Do you pity me?" And she said yes, that she did. And immediately he goes, "So will you marry me?" And she said that she would, and she did. And so the engagement story is unique, and for those of us who like a little small letter R in our romance, not terribly satisfying. Right. So Blake got involved in the political movement at the time. All right, so remember, he's a dissenter. He's outside the norm in almost every respect, and he sees the abuse that happens to regular people, and believes that the only way to make progress is for the people to unite and revolt. He loved the idea of the French Revolution and the American revolutions. He thought that the people should own their government and should be singly responsible for their outcomes. He wore the red cap supporting those movements, and mostly because Blake is at the front end of Romanticism, the idealism of the revolution is still with him through a good chunk of his work. Obviously, as we get further into especially the French Revolution and the corruption that evolves from that experience, a lot of our other romantics get disillusioned by revolution. But boy, Blake is all about it. He believed in the imagination, and that imagination that for him was the conduit to the imaginative experience or transcendence for Blake was scripture and visions, and that is for him a unifying experience. It links the human experience with the divine and makes all things possible, all truth discoverable. And so his imaginative process involved looking at reality understanding his visions, taking the scripture that he knew and drawing some analytical conclusions from that provided the kind of aha moment that allowed him to become the visionary that he truly was. So, Blake argues that all religions are essentially one, that we are in service to one God who created the world, and that God was serious when he talked about how we treat human beings and how we should address each other. He believed each one of us had that divine spark, and he called it a poetic genius. Now, Emerson's going to call it something else. Wordsworth is going to define it in a different way. All of the Romantics have a particular way of identifying what they believe as the essential divinity inside human beings. And for Blake, he believed that the poetic genius exists in all of us, and that if we are capable of pursuing the ideas and the words and the visions that each one of us has, that we can make a transcendent connection between the physical and the divine. To him, that was critically important, and it boils down all of the dogma and all of the what he would call crap of institutions in society that he believed were greedy, self-indulgent, arrogant, and corrupt. Right. He had issues with organized religion. Okay, so this isn't terribly different from the writers of the Enlightenment period, but his views were that God existed within each and every one of us, but that the institution of the church or the institution of religion were the restraints that allowed people to be confined outside their natural selves. So instead of becoming one with the truth, instead of having transcendent experiences, he said that prisons are built with stones of law and brothels with bricks of religion. So he really fought the whole idea of government, of church, of politics, of the military, of any institution that tried to force people into a particular way of living, especially when he realized that a lot of the leaders of these institutions were in it for themselves and not for the people. He was anti-reason. Obviously, the Romantics were not big on the scientific, natural law ideas that the Enlightenment writers were so intrigued by. His famous picture of Newton, Isaac Newton, sitting in the depths of the ocean, focused on his compass when all of the sea is surrounding him and the miracle of nature is all around him. He can't see beyond the direction his compass is pointing. Now, symbolically, this famous painting suggests how Blake felt science and reason limited the spirit of the human being, and especially the imagination of the human being. So much of Blake's work deals with the struggles between natural energy, passions and reason, and organized religion. He hated any kind of constraint that made human beings unequal to each other. So slavery, gender bias, all kinds of institutions that made some people better than other people were institutions that Blake abhorred. He believed in women's rights. He was one of the first important writers to actually get out there and say that women, races, men, blacks, whites, everybody should be equal and have the same rights under the law. Blake had some issues with what he thought were restrictions that the Old Testament God, the old ideas placed on people. And that he believed that the God that most people were worshiping in their churches was the Old Testament God, who was more of a demon, who liked to strike people and kill villages of people and throw somebody into power at the same time that he took others from power. We are only going to be looking at his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. But the Book of Urizen is a satire, a parody of the Genesis story that approaches the idea of the God being that Old Testament God who's forcing people into a particular constraint. Blake loved Dante, and Dante's Inferno comes in the first part of this course. At the end of his life, Blake was asked to illustrate, do the printing for Dante's Inferno. And this is one of the most famous illustrations that he did of the level of hell that is dominated by sins of the flesh and by passion. And if you can see the detail inside this slide, you can see the whirlwind and see the bodies of people that are wrapped in that whirlwind and blowing about inside it. Dante's idea was that people who are governed by their passions at some point have no control over those passions, and they give in to them, and then they're caught in that vortex that they can't get out of. And they're not in as serious a level of hell as others are, because it's a sin of the flesh, like the devil made me do it kind of thing. And I lost control and couldn't regain control for a period of time. But this illustration is one of Blake's most famous outside his Songs of Innocence and Experience. And it, I think, does a great job symbolically illustrating that idea of being caught inside of passion. Ancient of Days is one of my all-time favorite Blake pieces of art. And what he wrote to go along with this particular portrayal of God is to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. I think the use of color and the creation aspects of this are just magnificent. So, when Blake died, he had been working and his health had deteriorated somewhat, and so Kate was with him when he passed, and he said his last words to her were, "Stay, Kate, keep just as you are. I will draw your portrait, for you have ever been an angel to me." And at that he passed, and I think it's a little bit of redemption for that horrible way in which he proposed to her. But she was very clearly a helpmate in every possible way to him. And even though Blake believed in free love and sexual expression, there's nothing to indicate that he and Kate were promiscuous or not faithful to each other. They seem to have made a good life for themselves. And frankly, because of the way that Blake drew and etched his printings, he was dealing with a lot of chemicals, and those chemicals were smelly and dirty, and I'm sure that he always was just a mess. So maybe that's part of the reason why he and Kate were loyal to each other. But maybe if we want to be smaller romantics, we could just say that they were truly soulmates and deeply in love. The Songs of Innocence and Experience are Blake's most famous works, especially for an introductory literature course. And we're going to look at the two contrary states of the human soul and how Blake uses those to get to some kind of imaginative experience that allows him to explain the way humans should live, how those two contrary states of the human soul can come together to make something that is more meaningful and more deeply spiritual than either state on its own would be. We've already looked at the picture of the lamb in class. Here's another version of it. I think the symbolism in the artwork is outstanding, and I don't think it's possible to truly understand Blake's poetry without seeing these pictures.